and welcome to Meeting Midway, Tier 2 Prevention, hosted by the Missouri Department of Mental Health. My name is Carl Honger, and I will be your chaperone as we walk together through Tier 2 supports. What is it? How does it work? What does it use, and how do we use it? Together, we'll do a deep dive with each episode into this topic to gain greater knowledge about this subject. At the end of each episode, it's hoped that you'll have a greater understanding about Tier 2 supports and see how it relates to your daily lives. And with that, let's move on to the show. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Meeting Midway. On this episode, we'll be discussing how we know if agencies are ready for Tier 2 implementation within their organization, which we often refer to as Tier 2 readiness. We'll go over what elements are essential to implementing Tier 2 systems of support and why and how it directly impacts both the individual that receive these services and the providers who utilize them as well. To begin, let's quickly revisit the structure of the multi-tiered system of support, also known as MTSS. The Missouri Department of Mental Health Division of Developmental Disabilities is working to increase the state's capacity for support, and one effort towards this goal is helping providers implement the tiered support framework. Organizations who implement this framework develop a full continuum of care for those they support in order to maintain a healthy population. The framework helps service providers create strong systems of support, which include areas like data collection and analysis, coaching of staff, and recognition efforts, while also implementing positive behavioral support practices for the individuals they support. Ideally, in a healthy population, at least 5% or less of the individuals need Tier 3 support. About 10 to 15% need Tier 2 support, and the remaining, about 80 to 85%, only need Tier 1 support. There are three distinct tiers within this framework. First, Tier 1 consists of universal, ongoing practices that increase the quality of life of the entire population. Tier 2 consists of short-term, targeted interventions matched to the needs of the individual who are at risk of poor outcomes. And finally, Tier 3 consists of short-term, intensive interventions, often clinical-level support that is matched to the needs of the individual who are at high risk or already experiencing poor outcomes. As a continuum of care, the framework layers on support as a person's needs increase. So what does that look like? As I previously shared, Tier 1 builds universal systems of support, which focus on the implementation of positive behavioral strategies that everyone needs to have a good quality of life. These are things like a safe place to live, positive and healthy relationships, access to healthcare, meaningful choice and activities, and person-centered strategies. Tier 1 support should always be happening, and a lack of universal supports quickly leads to poor outcomes. However, Tier 2 and Tier 3 are not forever supports. They are only layered on top of Tier 1 if the person's needs are not met in Tier 1 alone. Tier 2 builds targeted systems of support, which focus on implementing risk screening to identify people within a supported population who are at risk and utilizing an implementation process to address risk before it bubbles up into a crisis. Interventions in Tier 2 are targeted for the individual identified as at risk and are meant to be easy, packaged off the shelf, and match the person's needs. Tier 2 supports are eventually faded out when no longer needed, and the person being supported is self-managing. You don't need a specialized degree to use these interventions. Tier 3 builds intensive systems of support, which focuses on implementing systems that support integrated clinical treatment. This support is the most intensive and individualized, as well as the most expensive because it often involves clinical professionals such as BCBAs, psychiatrists, LPCs, and so on, who are implementing clinical treatment plans, which are again faded out when the person no longer needs them. So having gone through all of that, what exactly do we mean by Tier 2 readiness? At its core, Tier 2 readiness is about preparedness, ensuring agency teams, resources, systems, and policies are aligned to support identified individuals who are at risk and have processes to help mitigate risk and prevent a crisis. In other words, providers routinely monitor individuals within their system and has a toolkit to address risk before an individual experiences a crisis. But that begs the question, how do we know someone or a group of individuals may be at risk? And what should an agency have within their current systems to address this risk if identified? To answer the first question, I suggest listeners go to episode 14, Tier 2 Risk Screening, to refresh their memory on this topic. To provide a summary of that episode for our discussion here, risk screening is a process where an organization develops predetermined criteria of what they consider risk and ensure data is collected by their staff and is routinely monitored. Some examples of risk criteria in human service organizations might be a certain number of incident reports in a span of time, or how many times a reactive strategy, such as physical restraints or de-escalation tools, was used to support a person in a span of a time. By identifying at-risk individuals within a supported population, human service organizations can proactively put in targeted supports to reduce risk and prevent crisis. Think of it this way. People brush their teeth and see a dentist for general health. This would be Tier 1. However, while at the dentist, they see a cavity forming and address the cavity then, thus limiting further decay of the tooth. This is Tier 2, monitoring and acting when necessary to prevent further issues down the road. To answer the second question, Tier 2 recommends evidence-based positive behavioral support interventions be added to the human service or organization's toolkit when situations warrant. Some of these evidence-based interventions have been discussed in previous podcasts already. These include check-in, check-out, enriched environments, and safety crisis plans. However, this is not simply taking out a tool and hoping that it works for the job. There should be a process to identify what interventions match the person's needs. Human service organizations have to have an in-depth knowledge of these targeted interventions and understand who benefits from them and who does not to be successful. So now that we have reviewed what Tier 2 functions is within this framework, what are the essential elements an organization needs in place in order to start implementing Tier 2? First, organizations need a coaching system. Under Tier 2, specific, easy-to-use interventions need to be implemented by direct care staff with fidelity. For this to occur, teams need to be trained in specific Tier 2 interventions by competent staff who serve as coaches. Furthermore, training should be consistent across the agency with competency checks along the way. Within Tier 1, you should have built a coaching system focused on staff competency using ongoing universal positive behavioral supports. In Tier 2, you would expand on that coaching system to support Tier 2 intervention coaching. Second, recognition. This is a hallmark of the MTSS model and is further highlighted within Tier 2. Systems should be in place to ensure individuals who are supported by staff and staff themselves receive frequent positive consequences for engaging in behaviors we want to see. This can range from simple verbal praise, meaningful tangible rewards, and so forth. In Tier 1, a human service organization would develop a recognition system that targets the behaviors and values that have been identified as part of their Tier 1 implementation for both staff and individuals being supported by the organization. At the Tier 2 level, we would also use this recognition system and expand its scope to include Tier 2 implementation. In other words, we would define what behaviors we want to ensure are rewarded when staff or individuals do the behaviors we want to see. This helps encourage retaining the new skills we are teaching as well as maintaining the top behavior over time. Lastly, monitoring and data tracking. Effective Tier 2 implementation requires strong and robust data systems. This is essential in Tier 1 as well. However, in Tier 2, the data systems should be expanded to track and routinely monitor predetermined risk criteria for the organization, as well as monitoring outcomes and our treatment integrity with fidelity. We've already touched on this a bit, but it's important to highlight that when trends are identified, teams can then review current situations and recommend specific interventions as needed. They are not basing information on word of mouth or gut feelings. Rather, they have data to support their views, and the data should support the type of Tier 2 intervention that is implemented. Apart from these three essential elements, it should also be known that agencies who are ready for Tier 2 should also have identified and implemented teams within the organization who are dedicated to this effort and have knowledge and training on evidence-based interventions that assist in these efforts. Now that we understand Tier 2 readiness and what's needed, let's move on to why Tier 2 is essential for providers to have and why it directly impacts both the individual that receives these services and the providers who utilize them as well. The first and most common reason why Tier 2 is essential for providers is simply the act of being ready and being able to respond to risk. Think of it this way. Instead of being stuck in a cycle of reacting to crisis, Tier 2 provides a way to proactively identify support needs and address them timely and effectively. We also need to understand that any individual's life is fluid and marked with ups and downs. This is true for everybody. Sometimes an individual who is struggling or showing some risk indicators, it may be likely due to the changes in their environment or their health, or could be due to a skill deficit. It might also be their history is influencing how they act in the present. Tier 2 provides an approach that understands behavior always has a reason behind it. And if we can identify risk early and put in the right supports matched to that person's needs, then we can ensure positive outcomes. Second, Tier 2 is essential because it builds on a human service organization's capacity for support and limits the amount of crisis events experienced by the population being supported. By developing systems to 1. Monitor for risk, and 2. Having a well-trained staff knowledgeable about Tier 2 interventions, helps to prevent putting out fires as they pop up because we are getting ahead of the crisis. Developing these systems of support within an organization supports their time, resources, and makes them more fiscally efficient. It prevents taxing time-limited and expensive clinical resources by proactively working to reduce risk. You have the foundation of Tier 1 to keep your agency functioning routinely, but you also have Tier 2 systems of support to help your agency identify risk and prevent difficult moments when they arise. Put another way, you can prevent having to engage in firefighting if you move to fire prevention. Finally, Tier 2 is not meant to be long-term, and the goal is to develop greater independence for the individual or groups of individuals receiving services. What do I mean by not long-term? Intervention should be targeted to those that need it, and faded once the person is able to self-manage without much staff support. And then, what do I mean by greater independence? Each intervention within Tier 2 encourages greater independence for the individual to self-manage their own behavior and to advocate for themselves. For example, under a check-in, check-out, a mentor will provide some expectation on goals to work towards throughout the day, and then routinely check in with the individual throughout their day on their progress. At the end of each day, the mentor and individual can reflect on what went well and what did not go well, and the mentor will provide a positive consequence or reward for the individual if they met their goals, or provide encouragement and empathy to try again the next time. However, the goal would be to fade out the check-ins and mentor support over time, and have the person being able to self-monitor their own behavior on their own. In saying all this, because Tier 2 is short-term and promotes greater independence, it not only increases an individual's independence, but also frees up resources and staff that might be needed in other areas. And this by far is the number one way that it impacts the individuals and the providers who utilize it. Okay, so a lot has been discussed on this episode. We hope that the information shared will make you consider implementing the Tier Supports framework and understand what elements are needed to successfully start implementing Tier 2. On the Missouri Department of Mental Health's webpage, we have a Tier 2 webpage where you can find additional information on Tier 2 readiness. We'll put this information in our show notes below for everyone to review. Furthermore, you can always reach out to tier2@dmh.mo.gov to inquire more. We'll end this show with a simple comment that we hope providers strongly consider. Tier 2 is an investment in your agency, your staff, and the individuals you serve. It will strengthen your ability to respond to risk in a proactive way before situations become critical, thus preventing putting individuals and/or your staff at risk. Consider building these supports as an investment into your organization's infrastructure and reap the rewards that it offers. And with that, we hope that you enjoyed this show. Thanks. Hey everyone, this concludes our show. Thank you for stopping by to learn more about Tier 2 supports and taking a deep dive into this topic with me. If you enjoyed the show, learned something, or perhaps feeling generous, please feel free to hit the like and subscribe feature to receive additional information on shows as they come out in the near future. And with that, please remember to be hopeful, bold, and adventurous in all that you do. Take care, everyone. Bye.